All right, today's video, we're just going to run around different sites on the property and talk about biochar stuff. These are the, commonly asked questions and comments and the stuff I think needs to be talked about and addressed. I'm not really organized. I just have like a list of stuff I want to talk about, and it's just going to be kind of off the top of my head. So strap in, it'll probably be pretty long, but if you're interested in biochar, I think there's some interesting talking points here. Now, first we're going to start with, does it work? Does it really actually work? People want to know, they're skeptical, and that's understandable because there's a lot of really tall claims about biochar. I mean, it's the next thing that's going to save the world. The short answer is yes, it works. If you look at the information on the anthropogenic char soils, the terra preta from the Amazon, and the African dark earths, and also the research that I did on the use of charcoal as a soil amendment in the 19th century America and Europe, and I'll put links to that. And you don't think it works at all, we don't even have anything to talk about. That's just crazy. I mean, it obviously can have a profound long-term effect. Now, whether it will work for you in your soil and how well, that's the important question. Asking whether it works or not is kind of the wrong question. The question is, how well is it going to work for you in your situation with your gardening style and all that stuff? Now, that is an unknown, and unless your next door neighbor has tested it, then you're just going to have to try it out for yourself. If you want to be promised like a certain type of result and a certain amount of result, that's not realistic, I mean, that's not how life works. Is it worth experimenting with? Oh, hell yeah. It's understandable why people are excited about it and think it's going to save the world and fix everybody's problems. It is pretty amazing. And there's also nothing else that gives you the long-term results. There's so many things we do in our garden that are short-term results. So let's take a look once again at the same bed that I always show, because it's still my main comparison bed. And the reason it's a comparison bed is because I have 3 different amounts. Now, I've been trying to treat this bed equally. Like when I planted this bed this year, I did the same thing across the whole bed. I added the same amount of amendments to the whole thing and all that stuff. As soon as I planted it, I got sick, and it snowed, and then it snowed again, and then it pounded rain over and over again. And I've never got it covered. I was going to cover it with plastic and stuff like that. So it's a total disaster, but it still shows pretty obviously the differences between these 3 sections of bed, which again are 10% on this end, 5% in the middle, and 0% charcoal on the other end. Look at these radishes across the back row. Again, these are not, exemplary by any means, but they are at least growing in the 10% section. Right about in this area, we switch to the 5% section, going down 5%, 5%, and down there where you might see some little scruffy green things is the 0% section. So once again, every time we look at this bed, it shows the same, graph-like difference between these sections of the bed, and the 10% has always been better than the 5%. Okay, now another thing I want to discuss is, in terms of effectiveness, you have to look at the whole picture. You have to kind of look at a more global picture and not this like simplistic, mechanistic, if I add this much percent, because people always ask that too. They ask like, how much do you add? That's a great common question. How much do you add? Well, I don't know how much you should add. I can tell you what my experience is, but what I can tell you is that you need to do the experiments. You need to set up experiments just like this, and you can get a whole bunch of information. Now, that's not just your soil and climate. It's like, what crops do you grow? How do you fertilize them? How often do you fertilize them? How much amendments are you bringing in? Maybe you have raised beds that are full of, potting, quote-unquote, soil, which is mostly organic matter, that you got a dump truck of and you filled your raised beds. I mean, the difference between planting in that with a certain percentage of biochar and planting in this with a certain percent may be different. Also, if I was really consistent with fertilizing, maybe the differences between these wouldn't be that much. All I did is I dug some stuff in, I put some stuff on the surface, and I just abandoned it. It got rained and snowed on. And, obviously the amount of stuff that I'm putting into the soil is doing more for me in this section of the bed. That's obvious. And it's been consistent. But if I were to do things a lot differently, I might get a different result. So bottom line is you just need to experiment, and we'll talk some more about that and what experiments I think people should do. All right, one of the most common questions I get asked, maybe the most common, is do I precharge my biochar, and how do I precharge my biochar? I do not, I have never, and I probably won't start anytime soon. This would require a whole video in itself to cover well, but I'll just give you the quick gist right now. If we look at that bed that we just looked at, which is like 10%, 5%, 0%, I used raw char in there in spite of everyone's warnings not to, because I wanted to find out what would happen, right? So instead of acting out of fear, I just did the experiment I needed to do to see if everyone was right, or see, just find out data, basically. Now, they were right. The first year, the growth in that end of the bed was very bad. It was the exact opposite of what it is now. There was almost nothing on this end, and it was, plenty on this end, except for the peas, because peas make their own nitrogen, so they did okay in that end. But everything else was exactly opposite. But within 2 seasons, or, like a couple of crops, everything reversed. And suddenly, this end was much bigger. So that's what can happen if I do absolutely nothing, like no pre-charging at all. Now, I don't do that, but I'll get to that in a minute. But one argument people might make is like, well, how do you know that it wouldn't be better if you pre-charged it? Well, how do you know that it's better if you do pre-charge it? I mean, we need to set up long-term experiments to find that out. Also, we're looking at the, the way this stuff is in there right now, and the leek crop that I did recently, we're looking at like 400 to 600% more growth in the 10% end. Like, how much better do I need it to be? My concern is that I spend as little time and energy as possible on, putting my char stuff together. I have probably 800 or 900 gallons of charcoal over here that need to get in the soil. And that's, how do I make that happen? What can I do that's going to require the least amount of effort and is going to have, very good results? And so far, since that first bed, what I do is I add stuff. Like, obviously with this, there's no nutrient problem. I'm getting like these food scraps that I get twice a week. I throw them in this pit. I throw charcoal and dirt on top of them, which I still need to do. So obviously there's no problem there. With other beds, what I do is I just maybe add like 3 times as much fertilizer or stuff, manure, whatever I have, old weeds, anything that's going to add extra nutrients to counteract that nutrient sink that happens when you first add charcoal to the soil. And I have not, since that first bed, ever had a failed crop for the first year. Were my crops as good as they possibly could be? Like, maybe they would be a little better if I pre-charged. I don't know. Maybe. I don't really care. It's like I found something that works. It's worked consistently. I usually get very good crops, often exceptional crops the first year, and I am perfectly happy with that. I think one assumption that we can make is that when we add anything to the soil and then bury it, deeply in the soil, whatever we add in there is going to change. I don't think we should make too many assumptions. It's not, it's not safe to make too many assumptions, but I think that's a pretty safe assumption that no matter how you set it up, it's going to end up doing what it wants. And, certain microbes are going to be favored. It's different depths of the soil, and everything's going to change. So my theory is, and this just works for me, I don't need to prove it or anything. It's just, it makes sense, and I do it because it works so far, is I just add a bunch of stuff. I add fertilizers. I add leaf mold from the forest for extra microbes usually. I add manure teas. I add old weeds, dead things, whatever. And I figure it can just sort itself out, right? It's going to be buried under there, and it's going to have conditions that are going to be conducive to different things. If I just give it a bunch of stuff and a bunch of different kinds of microbes and fungus and stuff, it can sort itself out. Now, I understand the theory of, making a special kind of tea or adding special things and all that, but to actually prove that that is working to good effect is, somewhat difficult. It's actually quite difficult. Not that it couldn't be done, to some satisfaction. But I think that the important thing is to realize that most people who are pre-charging their biochar and saying, oh, well, I'm adding these important microbes and stuff, you're largely working on faith. All our conditions are different. Things are going to happen the way they happen. Obviously, the traditional anthropogenic soils like terra preta and the African dark earths and stuff, were not made on some kind of scientific principles. They just threw the stuff together. The soils are still fertile. They still have a much higher fertility than the surrounding soils, and they're still working, and that's good enough for me, and that's basically what I'm doing, with this kind of setup. All right, let's move on.
He's not moving. He's definitely not active.
Yeah, he's badly injured. His face is all crushed.
Shit.
I probably just stepped on him.
How do I crush my charcoal? People ask that all the time. I don't have a good way to do it yet. I've thought about it quite a bit. I've tried to come up with ideas, but I just haven't been able to experiment with any of them. So my main idea has been to use a ball mill. A ball mill is just basically a big drum with heavy things in it, like rocks or chunks of metal. They used to use, balls of steel. And as the drum tumbles, the heavy things, lift and they drop on top of whatever you're trying to crush. So I think that could be a really good option. Anyone that has a chipper shredder, like a garden shredder or something like that, that should work great. Just make sure that the charcoal is damp first, not wet, but damp, because that'll keep the dust down. And that should work great. I have one, but I have to hook it up to something. I don't have an engine to hook it up to. I think eventually I'll probably hook it up to like a PTO or just maybe the rim of a car, put a belt on it or something like that. But all that takes time and energy that I don't have right now. In the past, I've just walked on it. I've, crushed it like that. People say put it in a bucket and stomp it with a log or something. I mean, look here. There's probably 800 or 900 gallons of charcoal right here. So what can I really do? So lately I've just been not doing anything. Something that a lot of people have suggested is trying to just put it in a driveway or a walkway and walk or drive over it until it's crushed. That sounds like a pretty good idea. It's just that, there's various potential problems with that. One is the stuff might blow away, right? The finest stuff would blow away. In my case, I have a gravel driveway, so if I put that on there, I'm going to lose some mixed in the gravel, or I'm going to rake up a bunch of gravel. Some of it's going to blow away. If it rains, it's going to wash away. So, if I could come up with like a really heavy-duty fabric tube of some kind, or something like that I could drive over and it wouldn't get completely ruined right away, driving, over it with my big truck or a tractor or something, on top of sharp rocks, then maybe that would work. So if that works for you, I think that's a pretty good idea. But again, it depends on the scale. Look at the scale I'm doing. So even with that method, it's pretty challenging to crush a large quantity of char. So at this point for me, I kind of feel like I need a somewhat industrial solution, and I think the chipper, hammer mill type of a chipper shredder, garden shredder is probably a pretty good way to go. I had a pile of charcoal right here that was from making that video, Stop Burning Brush video, and I just moved the stuff up here and I piled it to store for a while. And when it rained, it washed nutrients out of the ash and came down this way, and you can see maybe the stuff here looks a little more green. Like this is obviously more green than that right there. That's the same plant. I hope you can see that, but like right there, there's a cluster of this same plant. It looks, half as green. It just doesn't have this flushed out, healthy look. Now that's from nutrients in the ash. And another common question or comment is like, are you sure it's not just the nutrients that's the biochar effect, the nutrient from the ash, or it is just the nutrient from the ash? No, it's not. Of course I've thought of that, and I have the experience to say that that's not true, because I've been using ash in my gardens for decades now. I mean, like over 20 years. So I understand what that does in the soil. It's very temporary. This is what slash and burn is about, right? You go to the forest, you cut the forest down, you build big piles, you burn it into ash, and not charcoal, but ash, and then you mix that with the soil, and it grows crops for a few years. And we all know, the connotation of slash and burn in general is just negative, right? Because you destroy the forest and then you have to move and you have to keep doing it over and over again. Ashes are transient. If I put ashes on an area of this, meadow or something like that, and I put on enough, we're going to see this effect right here. In like a year or two, it'll be gone and you won't see any difference at all. Now in the short term, this can skew your results, right? Because you may notice this growth and you say, oh, charcoal's great, the charcoal's benefiting my soil. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What we really want to look at is the long term and how much, that affects. So for instance, when I set up an experiment, I added ashes to the end with no charcoal, just to try to kind of compensate, and even it out a little bit, because I knew there was going to be some ash nutrient. in my charcoal. So if I had a certain amount here, a certain amount here, I just wanted to add some ash to even out the results. Not very scientific, but at least it's something. But in the long term, honestly, trust me, it has very little long-term effect, if any. And another question you get a lot is, how does it work? You know, I mean, it depends on who you ask. I think the much more important question, vastly more important question, is, does it work? The answer to that is it can work. We already discussed that. How it works is real interesting, and it could, you know, lead to us being able to use it better and design better, you know, design systems better and stuff like that. And I think that's great. But just keep in mind that this is the less important, you know, thing as how it works, and just the fact that it does work, we can operate on. You know, and we're never going to understand all the like delicate intricacies of this process. Like, you know, we take this stuff, we bury it in the soil, the climate varies, you know, the microbes vary, the soil's going to change. Like, this is going to change over time, and it's going to seek some kind of natural equilibrium that we're not going to be able to fully understand. Like, this idea that, you know, science can plumb the depths of the universe and understand everything is just silly, right? It's just silly. And we don't need to. That's the most important thing here, is we don't need to. Like, we could just say, you know, I do this, I've been doing it, you know, what 10 years down the road, I'm going to say, you know, I've done this, I'm doing it, it works, I'm going to keep doing it. Like, that's enough. You know, at some point, that's enough. And the rest of it is icing on the cake. So the common reasons people say it works is it catches and holds nutrients, which it does. I mean, charcoal is well known for catching on to and holding on to things. It's used for filtration because of that reason. It definitely holds ammonia and nitrogen, which are, you know, major plant nutrients. What else it holds, I honestly haven't been interested enough to even look it up. Like, that's how little interested I am in it. I should be more interested. It's information I kind of want to know. I just haven't got around to it yet. Because again, the important thing to me is, does it work or not? I'm doing this because I want to grow more stuff. And then the other one is that, you know, a piece of charcoal contains this huge amount of pore space, and so that means it has a huge surface area, and that surface area all inside of here, like if you were to spread this out, that provides places for microbes to live, and that those ultimately benefit the soil if in a healthy soil. People also talk about, like, well, does it really last forever? Like, how long does it really last on the ground? They're skeptical of that. That's natural, of course, too. It lasts a long damn time. Like I said, there's anthropogenic char soils. That means human created, basically. You know, they're over 1,000 years old. You know, how long do you want it to last? You can dig archaeological sites that are extremely, extremely old and find charcoal. I found it, you know, buried many feet under the ground. You know, practical terms, let's think in practical terms, it doesn't really matter. You know, it's going to last a really, really, really long time. All right, probably the most important question, what should you do with biochar? If you can make it out of the brush and carbon that you have, you know, it's worth experimenting with. Even if you have to buy the stuff, I could justify going to the store and buying bag charcoal, you know, like oak or mesquite or whatever, and crushing that up. If it works, you know, I think the argument could be made for that. You can also buy, you know, charcoal produced for biochar now in some areas, and that'll become more and more common. But if you can make it yourself and bury it and do some experiments, again, you know, from the stuff that I've picked up elsewhere and my own personal experience, oh hell yeah, do it. And don't do it randomly. Okay, this is a piece of advice that I have for everyone who uses charcoal. The reason I don't throw it in my compost and just, you know, let it mature in there and then put it out is because I can't control how much is where. And I really want to control that. You know, I already know that in these garden beds, I want to use at least 10%. And that's important. Okay, so if I just throw it in my compost and it gets spread over the whole garden every year, you know, how fast is it going to build up, in what percentage, you know, how deep, all that stuff. So I really, really strongly urge people to not just add it randomly. Like, to get a real effect, you're going to need a certain amount. And again, you don't know how much that is in your soil, you know, with your situation. The soils vary, the charcoal varies, like the kind of charcoal I'm using, how it was produced. All this stuff varies. And if you want someone else to tell you that information, you're tripping. Like, you're just not going to get that accurate information that you want because of context. So what I really recommend people do is set up experiments just like I did. 3 parts is great, 2 parts is fine. You know, if you plant 10% in this half and 5% in that half and compare those for a couple of years, and you're like, oh, well, the 10%'s better. Next one, you can do 10% and 15% and see what happens there. You can set those up at once, or you can set one up each year. There's all kinds of experiments you could do. You could do depth experiments. I went from 12 inches on that bed to 24 inches deep on this bed. I'm probably going to do some that are 3 feet deep. So I could do 10% at 1 foot deep here, and then the other section of the bed I could do 10% at 2 feet deep. And if you just start thinking just a little bit about the differences in depth and quantity and stuff like that, then you can easily come up with a slew of experiments. I could fill this entire garden, every bed, with a different experiment that I already have jotted down or just in my head, or that I would make up easily. So do set up experiments. Again, it's not just for your benefit, which is really important. That's reason enough to do it, to understand what you should be doing. But for, you know, the collective group here, we can come up with more data and we have more to talk about. So we're not just speculating, you know, we can say it from personal experience, or we're not just citing someone else's experience or some study that they did. A lot of these studies are very, very myopic. A lot of them are pot trials, so they're done in, you know, growing pots. You know, the char is a certain type of char. It's prepared in a certain way. It's pre-prepared or pre-charged in a certain way. Like, how does all that, you know, relate to your situation? I'm not saying that those studies are useless. It's just important to understand that they have limitations, and their nature is myopic because they're highly controlled. The more factors you start to control in an experiment, the more myopic and closed it gets, and the less relevance it can have often to, you know, the real world experience. We need to just be real conscious of, you know, how relevant the data from those kind of studies are to our particular situation. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope this was, to me, this is all these are really interesting discussions. A lot of them could be expanded into videos, and maybe they will be in the future, but those are some common things that come up all the time. Later.